Good evening to you wherever you are, and welcome to the third in this academic year's African Literature Association lecture series. Thank you for joining us. Special thanks and an especially warm welcome, obviously, to our guest lecturer today, Dr. Matthew Omelsky, and to our moderator, Dr. Tsitsi Jaji. My name is Simon Lewis, and I'm a member of the ALA Executive Council and the organizer of the lecture series this year. While we're doing the introductions of today's moderator and guest speaker, please go ahead and let everyone know in the YouTube chat where you're tuning in from. And in fact, since one of the great joys of remote world is that you can type in questions while someone's speaking without interrupting them, please feel free to put any questions you have for Dr. Omelsky in the chat as he's speaking. We'll be monitoring the chat and feeding those questions to our moderator for today. Back in November, we played host to two venerable elders of the ALA, Professors Emeriti, both Bernd Lindfors and Ernest Emenyonu, who were talking about early concerns of the ALA, the politics and practice of professing African literature in the 1970s. Today, I'm pleased to host two much younger scholars who will be giving us a sense of our contemporary preoccupations. Let me start by very briefly introducing Professor Tsitsi Jaji. Born and raised in Zimbabwe, Jaji earned her BA at Oberlin College and her PhD at Cornell University in 2009. She was immediately snapped up by the high-powered English department at the University of Pennsylvania and is currently an associate professor of English at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. Along the way, her work has won her numerous accolades, including fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Schomburg Center, the Mellon Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, and the National Humanities Center. Tsitsi's first book, Africa in Stereo, Modernism, Music, Modernism, and Pan-African Solidarity, came out from the Oxford University Press in 2013, and it won the African Literature Association's first book prize, as well as honorable mentions from the American Comparative Literature Association and from the Society for Ethnomusicology. That book took full advantage of contemporary digital publication possibilities by including film clips and music referred to in the text, as well as additional illustrations, background information, and links to related sites. Dr. Jaji's multimedia interests and her expertise are further indicated by the scope of her two current projects, Cassava Westerns, a study of how global Black writers and artists are reimagining the American frontier myth, and Classic Black, a study of poetry set to music by Black concert music composers. That latter title indicates the polymathic nature of Dr. Jaji's talent. She is a gifted musician herself and an award-winning poet with 3 collections of poetry to her name, from which she has read at such venerable institutions as the Library of Congress and the United Nations. So with that background, we are more than fortunate to have her here with us at the ALA lecture series this Saturday morning. Thank you for being here, Tsitsi. Again, welcome. And I'll hand over to you now to introduce our guest lecturer.
Thank you so much, Simon, for such a generous introduction and for the invitation to introduce Matthew Omelsky and his wonderful new book, Fugitive Time. And I'm glad that you went on at such generous length, because I also want to really celebrate Omelsky's work in my introduction. I'll echo Simon's thanks to all of you for being here on a Saturday. And I welcome Matthew Omelsky, who's speaking to us now from Rochester, where he is an assistant professor of English and in the graduate program in Visual and Cultural Studies at University of Rochester. He's also a core faculty member in the Frederick Douglass Institute and Department of Black Studies, and a faculty affiliate in Film and Media Studies. His research is concentrated in the field of global Black cultural studies, with an emphasis on how 20th and 21st century Black artists from across the world express a desire for unfathomable freedoms. He's been honored with University of Rochester's highest teaching award for non-tenured faculty, and he currently serves on the executive committee of the MLA's African Literature since 1990 Forum. His roots in the ALA run deep, as he was the graduate caucus representative to the executive committee many years ago. The Frederick Douglass Institute is a special place for ALA and the perfect intellectual home for the transnational lens that Matt brings to his work. He works in the model of our own former ALA president and director of that center, Silas Kemijo, I would argue. Let's recall that Professor Kemijo has published books on Caribbean writers like Maurice Condé, on his fellow Cameroonian Mongo Betty, and now on the trajectory of Otabenga from Africa to his imprisonment in the US. In that, we can see the logic of Omelsky's own broad reach in Fugitive Time, returning us to an important tradition of the ALA as an intellectual organization. In Omelsky's book, he puts the artistry of Zimbabwean and Senegalese figures like Yvonne Vera and Issa Samb in conversation with Toni Morrison, with Cuba's Wilfredo Lam, with the film work of John Akomfra's Black British collectives, and with the inimitable polymath, musician, and more, Sun Ra. Omelsky earned an MA in Africana Studies at Cornell before coming to Duke University, where I had the privilege of directing his dissertation. Having done my own work at grad work at Cornell, I want to salute him for his terrific work, and also to say I see that upstate New York tradition, which over the years has boasted Anne Adams, Salah Hassan, and now Carol Boyce Davies, thinkers who have similarly contributed to the study of global Black cultures while showing us Africa's central role in 20th and 21st century humanities. And I'm invoking all of these figures because we really want to welcome you in a spirit of Ubuntu, Omelsky. We see that you come as a person, but as a person through other people, and we really salute that. Omelsky returned to upstate New York and the old stomping grounds of Frederick Douglass after a postdoctoral fellowship at Penn State University. In his book's acknowledgments, he tells us about the path that brought him to what he has now presented to us as Fugitive Time. How listening to jazz music, studying Ewe music, his undergraduate courses with the great Caribbean scholar Michael Dash and the photographer Lyle Ashton Harris started him on this multimedia journey. And how time teaching in Guadeloupe and studying Khalam, which you can see in the background there soon in his screen, in Dakar, pushed him forward. Perhaps it is that sense of rhythm, of beat, of time as always fleeting or even fleeing, the analeptic, as he shows us, that informs his presentation to us of Fugitive Time as a theory of utopia. Maybe it is his own crossings in a contemporary time and body both removed and humble in its relation to the many waters that has drawn his own attention to the eddying of the afterlives of humanity's worst violations in the Middle Passage and colonial projects. This is the spirit in which he presents us, not just afterlives, but alter lives, a formulation he follows from Jonathan Howard, another Duke PhD. Ultimately, what he is presenting us with, I believe, is the reminder of the power of the imagination. But I think we had better hear from the author himself. Matthew, I welcome you today. I celebrate you, and I offer you the floor. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Tsitsi. I'm filled with so much gratitude gratitude to be here with you. It really does feel like a full circle moment, like you mentioned, given how instrumental of a role you played in the first life of this project. Yeah, it's special. And I want to thank Simon Lewis for putting together this year's ALA lecture series. I want to thank ALA President Njoya Rezi, Akinade Shokan, and the other members of the ALA Executive Committee for the invitation to give this talk. First as a graduate student, then as a postdoc, and now as a professor, the ALA has been my closest and most dear intellectual home for almost a decade and a half. I've presented and workshopped much of my book at annual ALA conferences, so on many levels, this is an honor. I also want to thank everyone watching out there for taking time this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you may be. I appreciate it. So I'm going to talk about the book I published, as you know, at the end of 2023, called Fugitive Time, Global Aesthetics in the Black Beyond. My plan here is simple: to introduce the conceptual framework of the book, and then provide a couple examples from different chapters that illustrate that framework in different ways. So first, I'm actually going to share my screen, and hopefully I don't stumble over myself while I do it. So I want to begin actually by reading the introduction's opening paragraph, where I address the image you see here. Against an entirely white background, holding a black balloon with his outstretched hand, a young man rises. His nude body, turned to the side, is silhouetted in black. Toes pointing, chest leaning, he's tilted in flight. He gazes down as he moves up and outward, surveying what he's leaving behind. Another young man, standing below, gazes up at the rising one, reaching out to touch the flying figure's other hand, like he's sending him off. This image from the moment you doubt whether you could fly, you cease forever to be able to do it, an installation by American artist Shakeith, features, at least at first sight, two young men. The contours of the silhouetted figures, though, are unmistakably similar. Could it be a sequence, a movement of just one? Could it be that the figure standing on the ground is the young man only a moment earlier in time, prior to his flight, in advance of the balloon's lift, imagining himself rising away to new life? He has to imagine, the title suggests. He has to believe. What if this is a visual representation of one young man's anticipatory desire, his imagined movement in time from moment to moment, a map of the trajectory of his longing for the moment when he's at last unburdened of this world? So what I call fugitive time is the anticipatory consciousness that I read in Shakeith's image. It names the phenomenon in which one imagines what it might feel like to be free of the violence that has consumed Black life throughout the world for centuries. The anticipation of the outside of subjection is paramount, but the recurring haunting of violence as it bleeds into present consciousness remains fundamental, constituting the moment from which one flees. Fugitive time is not a theory of futurity or linear progress, but it is a theory of utopia. And its utopia lies in the anticipated moment when pain has at last vanished from the body, whenever and wherever that may come, bringing with it a new form of being and being in the world. As in all utopias, though, that moment of absolute release is elusive. If one does seem to touch on it, it quickly recedes. Instead, Fugitive Time is about sustaining the idea of the chase as a social gathering, the shared ecstasy of perpetually imagining in advance that moment of unburdening. As in Shakith's image, keeping an eye and a hand on the black balloon that just might lead in that next moment to new life. So the concept of fugitive time emerges from the intersection of the study of time consciousness and European continental philosophy and theories of fugitivity and Black studies. These latter theories broadly postulate the ways people of African descent have historically responded to their subjugation by evading the very societal structures that have rendered Black life unlivable. In my framing, fugitivity is refusal to acknowledge the interpolation that negates Black being. That negates Black being. It enacts, as Fred Moten puts it, a duty to refrain from the performance of the labor of the negative, to run away from the snares of recognition. As the Senegalese multidisciplinary artist Issa Sam insists of his own politics and practice, to contest is not to refuse, it's a form of acceptance, a way of assenting to another's terms. Sam, whose sprawling work I examine in chapter 4 of the book, instead opts to detach, refusing all forms of existing society. Fugitivity most obviously names a movement of the physical body, but it also suggests a form of consciousness that corresponds to the myriad desires that signal an as yet unrealized freedom. Saidiya Hartman describes this frame of mind as a collective dream of an elsewhere, a ceaseless set of imaginative operations. Fugitive Time builds on existing scholarship in global Black studies by theorizing fugitivity not just as a structure of consciousness, but of time consciousness specifically. The book proposes a way of conceiving of time within this strain of Black studies thought by drawing what's often referred to as phenomenological time, the study of the human perception of time as a constantly ebbing and flowing system of memories and anticipations. Dating to St. Augustine's 11th century Confessions, and later brought to prominence in the work of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, it's an approach that attends to the ways the mind registers the passing of time from moment to moment, and how this ever-fluctuating system contributes to one's sense of being and being in the world. But where these thinkers sought to uncover a universal humanness through phenomenology, Fugitive Time zooms in on memories and anticipations to uncover a culturally and historically distinct conception of time. The project presents not a monolithic temporality, but one of multitudes, examining how disparate African diaspora cultures produce their own distinct versions of this phenomenological fugitive time. And what's more, I see this notion of fugitive time both complementing and working from within the prevailing approaches to temporality in African diaspora studies that emphasize philosophies of history in work by Ayokoli, Imbalcom, Achille Mbembe, among others. Instead of conceiving of time principally in increments of years, decades, and centuries like these scholars and others, the phenomenological approach I undertake opens up a new kind of telescopic lens into the inconspicuous markings, woundings, and desires of the body, affording a magnified microscale view into the relationship between embodied violence and desired freedom and global African diaspora cultures. In this book, aesthetics is how we see and witness fugitive time, as I hope my opening with Shakith's image suggests. Rather than merely describe time consciousness, the aesthetic works in this book, to use Carolyn Levine's term, afford time consciousness. By this I mean that their materials, designs, their structures provide additional ways of perceiving the subtle movements of memory and anticipation. So Fugitive Time's indexing and montage editing and metaphor and tense and mood, and one musical instrument sound set against that of another, surrounds and complements those ideas, those deliberately articulated ideas of anticipated embodied escape, expressed in a song or a film or a novel, together evincing layers of kinetic movements, sedimentations of fugitive dreaming. Creative expression archives and maps these simultaneous temporal layers, providing a multidimensional lens into Black cultures and experiences from across the world. Finally, I want to underscore the project's geographical scope. This is a resoundingly global Black project. While certainly the evident connection among the circum-Atlantic geographies of this book, from Africa, the Caribbean, to North America, to Europe, is their common structural subjection that extends back centuries to the first Portuguese sea expeditions to the West African coast. The principal linkage among this book's geographies has more to do with the cultural responses to that violence, that which gets generated through the desire to be free. The idea of diaspora that organizes Fugitive Time centers on the global circulation of cultures, languages, and discourses produced through a network of practices, as Brent Edwards puts it, which produce not only new and unforeseen alliances on a global stage, but also unavoidable misapprehensions and misreadings. The diaspora of this project, in other words, is always contingent, in search of intimacies and alliances among people of African descent, but always marked by difference. Fugitive Time is allied with inspiring work by Tsitsi Chaji, Kagero Macharia, Xavier Lieberman, and others, which frame Black life in diaspora as globally differentiated, where the African continent is neither the periphery nor solely a historical point of origin, but a diverse, vital, and coeval contributor to diasporic circulations and belongings. Fugitive Time frames fugitivity as a transnational form of Black thought and experience, as the desire to flee the confines not just of the 19th century Southern plantation or the contemporary American carceral state, but also of colonial and post-colonial regimes that have suppressed Black life globally. So to think fugitivity in Zimbabwe and Martinique, for instance, beyond the sight of fugitivity's theoretical invention in American Black studies, reveals diverse vernacularizations of fugitive thought shaped by Southern African practices of prophecy and divination, or Caribbean historical practices of marronage. So fugitivity and its attendant time consciousness, I argue, can't be fully grasped outside this global frame. Examining works from Martinique, Zimbabwe, Senegal, Britain, and the United States, ranging from fiction and poetry to music, film, photography, and multimedia installation, Fugitive Time shows how this distinct experience of time remains since the late 18th century slave narrative, a dominant and recurring form of utopian time consciousness in global Black cultural production. So the first of the two isolated examples I want to share comes from Without a Name, the 1994 novel written by the Zimbabwean writer Yvonne Vera, which many of you are no doubt familiar with. In the case of both of these examples, I'm pretty drastically truncating them down to the most fundamental component parts of conceptual framing and close reading, focusing largely on their structures of anticipation. Set in 1977 during Zimbabwe's second Chimurenga, at the precipice of national independence from white settler rule, Without a Name features a woman protagonist named Majita who seeks to shed her body and mind of alienation and the memory of her experienced sexual violence. The novel affords a distinct lens into the ways in which Black women from throughout the world have been uniquely and historically targeted, allowing readers to listen to their voices and how they imagine a restructured society and being in the world. What the novel does, I contend, is present a seemingly paradoxical conception of fugitive time, moored by Majita's connection to her ancestral land. There's very much a desire to escape violence and subjection in the novel, a fugitive anticipation of that moment when pain at last vanishes from Majita's mind and body. But her desire for release is anchored by her sense of belonging to the geographic space of her people and the ancestors who inhabit that space. The sense of fugitive anticipation in the passage I want to discuss briefly here is engendered by sound, specifically the sound of the mbira, a lamellophone, which in the context of the Shona people is used as a kind of medium or technology to commune with ancestral spirits. In his influential study, The Soul of Mbira, Paul Berliner explains that among the Shona, quote, the mbira has been used in traditional religious ceremonies to create the essential link between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. The mbira is believed to have the power of projecting its sound into the heavens and attracting the attention of the ancestors, who are the spiritual owners and keepers of the land and the benefactors of the people's welfare, end quote. And without a name, Vera uses the mbira, I argue, as a metonym for a kind of ancestral force that creates a cyclical version of fugitive time. Majita seeks flight from the violence that she experienced on her ancestral land, specifically her rape by a freedom fighter on that land. But that ancestral land, represented in the sonic register of the mbira, ultimately beckons her back to return, to seek release in body and mind through a renewed ancestral connection. So I'll read a few excerpts from the 2.5-page sequence that is without a doubt the ecstatic peak of the novel's fugitive time consciousness. And the old man sat curled midway in the crowded bus along the aisle. He held the mbira possessively above his lap and played. The mbira sat in one half of a dried cell, a calabash. The shelter made the sound fall backward toward the back of the bus, where Majita waited. The gesture was unexpected and lavish. The sound reached her in generous waves of sustenance. Majita waited in a smooth and silent gaze. She turned her eyes from the window to the mbira and she cupped her fingers and held them forward. Her hands were still and seeking. Her eyebrows softened into arches of wonder. Her lips softened. The sound looped in waves over her head, curled downward, sunk deep in her chest where she had been irrevocably wounded, touching her gently and faithfully, tenderly and with mercy. There was forgiveness because she had longed for it. She heard the mbira grow loud, move nearer to her dream. She waited in waves of suspenseful wishing and longing, and rays of supple joy. She waited for a moment, merciful with release. But the mbira held out a promise. Up to this point in the novel, 3/4 of the way through, chapters have oscillated between the past and the present in fragmented pieces, often rendering past and present indistinguishable. The majority of the narrative is in the third-person limited voice, giving readers privileged access to Majita's consciousness. So in this passage, in the narrative present, Majita is sitting in a bus in Harare, headed back to her village to bring her newborn child home. But what's revealed only in the final pages of the novel is that this child strapped to her back in this bus is no longer living. Majida has strangled the unnamed child in an effort to free herself of her trauma, and she intends to bring his body back to her land and her ancestors. So the pain she's escaping, albeit fleetingly in her mind, is layered. The traumatic memory of being attacked by the freedom fighter, giving birth to this child, then killing this child and being weighed down in the bus by the child's body on her back. In the segment of the sequence I've read, Majita's swelling emotions become increasingly utopian in Vera's language of wishing, dreaming, longing. There's a sense that the instrument's sound somehow allows Majita to live in advance of the present moment, proleptically inhabiting a moment in time when her body has been unburdened by her ancestors who've been called to her by the instrument. Even if it's only for a moment as the sounds wash over her, the Ibira brings Majita back to her people, to her culture, to her land, generating belonging, intimacy, and release. The other brief example of Fugitive Time I want to draw out of the book is, on the surface, very different. It features the work of the American free jazz musician, band leader, and poet, Sun Ra. Like Vera's novel and each artist and artwork I study in the book, Sun Ra presents a dialectic of subjection and desired freedom that can be traced across his body of work. But his genre of this dialectic is shrouded in a kind of opacity, a refusal to detail precisely what constitutes that subjection or that freedom. So for instance, in one of the early leaflets Ra distributed on the street corners of Chicago's South Side in the 1950s, he writes that Black people are in the low places. There are none beneath them. By contrast, far more expansively, in a 1967 interview, he suggested that the planet is in such a bad condition with its wars and confusion. Throughout his career, he consistently presented this kind of sweeping sense of crisis that needed to be escaped from. The other side of this dialectic centers on what Ra calls, with deceptive complexity, myth. In his poem, We Hold This Myth to Be Potential, he describes a bridge doorway to another kind of unknown, living, lived life. The knowledge beyond the knowledge. Far beyond the knowledge is the infinity, the uncharted ignorance. Another poem called Wisdom Ignorance adds more layers to this. I quote, "The hope of continuation living being is myth. The myth is the seemingly false and the seemingly impossible. The borders of the realm of myth are vast and non-existent because there is no limit to the imaginative realm idea of the myth. Out upon the plains of myth, strange non-realities dwell, strange because they are not according to the propagated, accepted law." So myth, we might say, is an outside consciousness for Ra, an opaque ideal of ignorance, infinity, and non-reality. A frame of mind that paradoxically can't be known in advance, yet is somehow potential and imminent, driving a sense of anticipatory desire. For Ra, traces of this myth reach those who remain in the world of subjection, and giving them some perceptible sense of myth's transfigurative potentiality keeping that myth, keeping that hope and anticipation alive. Ra's myth, in short, is both the utopian ideal of ungoverned, unsubjected being, but also a driver of proleptic consciousness, feeding those in search of the temporal moment of transcendence, that indeterminately infinite life. Like Ra's body of work may cut against and cut away at coercive and constraining ideologies, but its fundamental concern is mythic escape. I'm opening an exit for you, he says in one essay, to get out of this before it's too late. This sense of mythic escape manifests in a few different ways, formally across both his poetry and his music. But one I'll highlight here is what I call his spacings. These correspond to the frequent, seemingly inscrutable silences, breaks, lulls, sustained pitches, and other iterations of openness that saturate Ra's poems and recordings. Together, they generate a sense of anticipation. They gesture to imperceptible, fugitive pathways, and they evoke the openness of flight. These spacings saturate Ra's poetry, particularly his later verse, in the form of ellipses, of variable lengths and placements. While many of Ra's poems conclude with similar elliptical extensions, few are quite like The Outer Darkness, a facsimile of which is pictured here on your screen from Ra's own typewriter. Before content and meaning, this poem is a visual form. The incrementally indented six-point ellipses at the start of several lines is relatively unique among Ra's poems, but it's the final 13 lines of streaming ellipses emerging from the undulation of those initial 6-point lines, like some cryptic Morse code-like enunciation, that sets this poem apart. That final shape almost resembles a V formation, a social act of flight that both emerges from and lunges out in anticipation of those final resounding words, the dark, unknown, eternal. The poem is saturated with ideas of outer space, the cosmos, and the catalyzing potential of music, all well-known preoccupations in Ra's poetics. And though myth is not mentioned directly, its aura clearly pervades in the language of an ever-quickening spirit and the multiplicities and potentialities of intergalactic music. Right? The poem's construction of myth bespeaks a fugitively proleptic inhabitation, a line of advanced sight toward new life forms and new consciousness. Time won't really allow for a full sense of how these poetic extensions and deferrals correspond to Sun Ra's music, including listening to some recordings. In his music, I have in mind literal silences, collapses in volumes, sustained pitches, and tapers that do a similar kind of work as the poetic device, providing space for breath, but also for proleptic vision, for flight extension, for mythic limitlessness, like the ellipses. The example I'll give and conclude my talk with is what I consider to be the musical version of his Outer Darkness poem, with its epic formation of ellipses. The track The Sun Myth on the heliocentric world of Sun Ra, Volume 2, on an album recorded in 1965, is a nearly 20-minute long double concerto for Ronnie Boykins on bowed upright bass and Sun Ra on piano and clavioline. And clavioline was an early electric keyboard. Interspersed among Boykins' and Ra are periodic collective screams, honks, and rumblings from the rest of the orchestra, Ra's band. One of its principal features is the drawn-out ending to the track. The track slowly peters out over the course of 2 full minutes, with a seemingly endless succession of pauses, ghost notes, breathy growls, and sotto voce screeches. The final 30 seconds is a slow, unedited fade-out, a tapering of percussionist Roger Blank softly brushing and scratching his cymbals amid intermittent full-second pauses. It's as if the cacophonous horns and clavioline from the previous 15 minutes have lifted us into the unknown infinity of the cosmos that Ra has told us about. And we're now soaring in outer space, floating weightlessly in the Earth's ellipsoidal orbit, waiting in keen anticipation of the moment to fire back up and reach further into the uncharted ignorance of deep space. The entirety of the track lifts us up and out as if we're already there, and then living and breathing Ra's myth in advance. In all, Sun Ra's work evinces a pathway, a fugitive tilt, a proleptic inhabitation of release in a far-out world. Thank you. I'll stop there. Appreciate it. And I will be glad to take any questions. Comments.
Thank you so much. This is so rich in terms of its overview, and also so intimate. You know, we get to dive in with you and into your thinking. So thank you for that. I actually want to take the privilege of asking this first question while the chat starts to populate. With what might seem like a very boring question, but it's also a personal one for me, which is that the pleasure of hearing you talk about your work and about the core conceptual stakes here is the clarity and the growth of it. I mean, I was really proud and enjoyed reading your dissertation, but I hear what were at that moment, in fact, proleptic impulses to address things that now have really settled into the arc of it. And one of the things actually, just as a comment that I heard and learned, and in the context of a presentation like this, through ALA and our kind of community of thought here, was just how important the natural world is as well to these questions of time, right? How does one live into the space in which one finds oneself, and that dimension of the ancestral land as, you know, a question of time and of relationality, but the land is the thing that allows you to travel across time, but that also is very pressing for us in this time. And I shouldn't say just the land; it's the space that you're talking about with the raw can't help but also evoke atmosphere and the airs into which we live. So it's just a comment to say that I see this speaking to the eco-critical as well, right? That we often think about time as an alternative to space and place. But one of the things we gain when you ask us and let us think about phenomenological time in this very grounded and specific itinerary is to see that that relationship is always about negotiating the relationship to place. And I think for me that really speaks also to what the fruit of thinking through a Black diaspora and this Black beyond really is. That's my comment, and one of the things I enjoyed learning today. But what I want to hear about is what was this journey of the evolution of this thought, right? And especially the nuance with which you're talking about the visual here, which is something you can almost only do in a book that has these gorgeous, and I do want to tell everyone there's a whole set of full color plates in it. So the short version of this is, how did this happen? It was great, and now it's gotten really, even more settled, more pointed. And I do apologize for I misspoke entirely. It is the proleptic, and that's not the analeptic. Although there's a way in which
ellipsis in the Toni Morrison chapter. Plenty of it.
yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So how did the project evolve from when it was under your supervision to today, 5 years, 6 years later?
Yeah, and I don't mean that to be an insider question in a way.
Yeah, I know.
And also for the work that we all do in our profession, which is to somehow arrive at a coherence and a lens into, oh, this is what connects things, that there's a struggle in the intellectual project of articulating how they fit together. And hopefully this is a question for our that speaks to our younger colleagues and question of this book, but also it's for all of us about that intellectual journey.
Right. Thank you. I think many of us write our dissertations in the humanities with the intention of it being already the book version of it. But then realize that it's most certainly not. At least that was my experience. I mean, in the dissertation version of this project was largely literature and cinema. And one of the things I wanted to do was make it more about aesthetics more broadly. So I really wanted to expand its archive, its aesthetic archive. And that meant that I could keep some chapters relatively intact in the way that they were. Although through the review process with Duke Press, they changed conceptually a whole lot. Like the Toni Morrison chapter and the Yvonne Vera and the No Violet with a Y chapter. But I wanted to bring other art forms into the project. So chapter 2 originally was just focused on Aimé Césaire's Notebook of a Return to the Native Land. And I wanted to figure out a way to bring another art form into it, because that poem, I mean, it's so iconic in our field, and it's been written about so much. I mean, you could fill a library with just the secondary criticism on this poem. And so I just went hunting for different kinds of visual material that related to his poem, and I encountered these 3 sketches by Wilfredo Lam, the Cuban painter, that he drew for the 1943 Cuban translation of Césaire's 1939 original version of the poem. And I discovered that nobody really had talked about in depth, nobody had really discussed those 3 drawings in relation to the poem. And they're these like wild surrealist poems that can be read in all different kinds of ways depending on where your gaze is. And so it just opened up a whole different way of framing that chapter, and it brought so many different more dimensions to Fugitive Time in Césaire's poem. And then I realized also that one of the missing links in the dissertation version was a chapter that had a direct conversation between disparate diasporic locations. In the dissertation version, I consolidated each chapter kind of was fixed in a kind of a singular location in large part, whether it was Martinique, the US, Zimbabwe, Britain, right? So I realized that and together, like I'm kind of cobbling together, I'm assembling, this larger kind of theory of time in this structure of global Black life. But I realized that I needed a chapter where I could kind of constantly um, constantly go back and forth with that with kind of a seeming disparate relationality. And so that's where the Sun Ra and Issa Sam chapter came from. Putting Senegal and the US in conversation. And two artists that have these like kind of mountains of bodies of work that on the surface are really that feel unruly because they worked in so many different kinds of media, and you can't really work your way through their bodies of work comprehensively. You have to think through their bodies of work conceptually.
Mhm.
Otherwise, you're just not gonna. You just can't really. You just can't account for it comprehensively. So I felt like I needed a chapter that um, that really thought about like the tensions and the resonances in a very immediate way.
Yeah.
And so that I would say those were those are the biggest transformations.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really helpful. It ties in with one of the questions that's come up. I'm gonna start with a question from Joya Urezi. And her question here is, I'll read the whole thing for you. Matt, I loved your notion of fugitive time. Can you explain why fugitive time is utopic but not futuristic? Aren't utopias typically futuristic or future oriented?
Yeah. So utopias are not so the way that I kind of frame utopia in the book. I mean, I draw on, like various different theoretical archives. On the one hand, I have this Black Studies archive, where whether it's, Saidiya Hartman, scenes of subjection, and kind of thinking about, the kind of the longings and desires that exceed the frame of civil rights and emancipation. Um, or Paul Gilroy's Politics of Transfiguration. Um, but on the other hand, I'm thinking with theorists like Frederick Jameson, who argues that utopian thought is less a blueprint for the future than a mode of thought for kind of negating unfreedom, right? For kind of absorbing unfreedom. And the other way, it also many of the different art objects I study in the book simply don't locate their utopian desires in the future. So, for instance, in Toni Morrison's work in Beloved, I look at this, I kind of trace this desire for ease in body and mind, this desire for kind of washing the mind and body of traumatic memory and kind of experienced violation, which comes in that next phenomenological moment, but Morrison stitches that into all these moments of anticipation and memory, where it's constantly shooting back and forth in the narrative. And so Sethe might remember a moment prior in her life when she longed for a moment of ease, right? So it's not necessarily a future moment, right? But also, you know, there's a whole body of thought in Black studies that like scholars like Jana Brown argued that, you know, the notion of the future is kind of fettered by notions of progress, right? Like this kind of historicist idea of thinking of a certain philosophy of history as moving toward these open futures that have historically positioned people of color in a lagging position, right? That's where this, you know, denial of coevalness that Johannes Fabian is talking about kind of keeps Black people, keeps people of color. So I didn't necessarily read future only strictly in the archive that I'm working with, but I also don't necessarily want to kind of prescribe a certain kind of historicism and reinscribe a certain kind of historicism into the archive, you know. But that's a great question, though. I go into more length in the book on that very question.
Thank you, Matt. Here's another question from Kirk Sides. Thanks, Matt. You quoted Ra as saying, quote, "We hold myth to be," quote. This struck my ear as possibly Ra riffing off of "we hold these truths to be." This made me wonder if Ra is thinking about myth or the activation of myth as a kind of perhaps contingent political formation. Would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Sun Ra in his poetry, he is constantly playing with words and allusions to other references, and I think he's totally, I think he's making that illusion that you're identifying, Kurt. I'm just reading the second part of the question. And I think politics saturates really everything that Ra does, whether it's his music or his poetry. I think a lot of people didn't really take him seriously, but that's other people's problem, not his problem. I think there's a politics to his critique of a world in crisis, right? There's a politics to his desire for another world, another way of being, living on another plane, right? Another mode of existence, right? Imagining Blackness otherwise. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Matt. We have a number of other questions, but we also have a good amount of time, so I'm gonna honor them individually. This is a question from Simon Lewis, and he'd like to know, how are your comments on Vera speaking to her oeuvre as a whole, or Vera, sorry, the historical sweep of her novels? And I'm thinking in particular what the idea of playing with the idea of memories of the future Memories of the Future, which comes up in Najanda's, in Najanda, the novella. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. I mean, I honestly, Vera's. Oftentimes people will say who's my favorite writer or whomever, and I'm always tempted to say Vera, because her writing is just so stunningly beautiful, and but also just so haunting at the same time. I so in the larger chapter, um, in the larger chapter on Vera and Bulawayo, I actually begin with Nahanda. Um, and I frame the chapter, I frame the relationship between Without a Name, Vera's Without a Name, and Bulawayo's We Need New Names as a part of a lineage that goes back to um, the um, the hanging of the prophet and spirit medium Nahanda at the beginning of Vera's novel, and in the way that Vera kind of accounts for at the beginning of that novel, and how Vera articulates that 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 execution by the British um, in this way that Vera um, Vera escapes her haunting, her execution, right here, her hanging, before they can actually kind of hang her, right? Sure, her kind of her body is able to kind of she's able to kind of transcend that moment of the epitome of colonial subjection, right? And so I use that moment in order to kind of trace kind of a history of Zimbabwean women kind of desiring to transcend historical and experienced violence, right, into the 1970s moment of Vera's We Need New Name, or sorry, of Vera's Without a Name, and into the early 2000s of Bulawayo's We Need New Names, which kind of where we kind of settle into the life of a young woman named Darling, who is living in a country that's crumbling, like politically, economically, and she kind of looks to the outside world, outside of her country, for a better life, and she moves to America thinking it's going to provide something better, but she realizes that it doesn't, and that the only better thing exists back in Zimbabwe before things fell apart, right? And they actually use that very term that we all know as Achebe's term, right? So yeah, so I kind of I think of I think of it as like a genealogy, moving from Nahanda in that chapter into the 21st century.
That's just great. Thank you, Matt. As you were speaking, it made me think about how Stone Virgins also opens with one of the hangings of early anti-colonial resistance in Bulawayo. And it's interesting because I've tried to think about some of the other big name women writers coming out of Bulawayo recently, and particularly about Novuyo Chuma and Sipiwe Ndlovu and Bryony Ream. And I couldn't quite address Vera, I think perhaps for similar reasons of a deep kind of attachment that felt like in an essay, why would one touch it? And I didn't touch no violet, which makes my whole sort of idea about Bulawayo as a particular space a little bit tendentious. But what's so helpful about your tracing this genealogy is it kind of helps me to figure out how, Vera talks about these cycles of post-war trauma and post-political violence trauma throughout her oeuvre. In a lot of Western versions, it's like this opening, as you well know, for being able to talk about Kurahundi. And so it makes me recognize this long-running project that Vera opens up about questioning what Chuma calls history and breaks that word, right? And so I think, number one, it makes me excited to go back to that. And I'm glad that Simon asked the question, but it also kind of shows us that although you're taking particular works as your kind of key way in, and particular voices, that you really are doing opening up sort of some much broader lenses in. You mentioned the word genealogy in the way that you're thinking about Violet Bulawayo, not the space Violet, and Vera. And I see there's a question that gets at some similar things, but on that really broad scale, from Catherine Cole. She says, it's exciting to get a preview of your book. Could you speak more about global Black cultural studies as a genealogy? And how does this phrase sit alongside African diaspora and circum-Atlantic? I think that's a very interesting question at a time when many departments are also thinking about what are they going to call themselves, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that is a great question. Like here at Rochester, we're in Black Studies, we're currently hiring a line in Global Black Studies, which we deliberately called it that. So honestly, so let's see. So I think the African diaspora in that formulation, oftentimes people often exclude the continent as a kind of coeval contributor to the circulation of culture and everything, right? Even if people like Tsitsi or Samantha Pinto or Brent Edwards argue for kind of a central place of the continent in diaspora, where I think it's becoming a little bit clearer in the last few years that the idea of global Blackness that it encompasses the continent in a co-constitutive way, and no more, no less than, say, North America or Europe or Latin America or wherever we may find people of African descent. Circum-Atlantic, I think that just kind of brings us into a slightly more narrow place, right? In the 90s, right, with Paul Gilroy's book, like the Black Atlantic was this, I think people are still thinking through that lens to a certain extent, but it's thinking largely through the Atlantic. But I think now people are thinking about global Africa or global Blackness, right, in the Indian Ocean, right, in Europe and in Asia, right? So kind of keeping us in the Atlantic kind of is a limiting frame, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. There's plenty of work that's still to be done in the Atlantic. I think those three terms are just doing different work. As for the genealogy, I think it goes back, you know, to to Du Bois marking out the world at the beginning of the 20th century as divided by the color line, right? It's a very deliberately global color line that he articulates, right? Right around the turn of the century and right around 1900. I think, you know, a part of the genealogy of global Black studies has to include kind of the great Pan-African thinkers, right? George Padmore, C.L.R. James, right? Who did so much work to kind of connect geographies, right? Insistently so, right? Or and same with, you know, negritude writers, whether it's you know, Aimé Césaire, right? And his insistence. I wouldn't those would be two kind of critical nodes that I would kind of mark out as part of that. And I'm you know, two examples. We could keep going. This is a conversation that could be an entire class.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. And I won't necessarily ask you to talk about it now, but if we have some time, I think it would be interesting to circle back to the problem of Black when we talk about Africa, right? That
Yeah.
I was recently surprised by the depth of objection from one of my colleagues here who will remain unnamed, but to not using the word Black is a problem if you want to talk about Africa, precisely for the reason that we had a disagreement in the MLA when they expanded the Africa Forum, right, and wanted to split it at the Sahara. What does happen to North Africa in this? How do we account for settler colonialism and the significant body of white South African writing? And of course, I think you and I would both probably say that it has to do with the global conditions under which what amounts to the blackening of the world with the imperial project, and with that early moment or inaugural encounter with the Portuguese, structures the
Right. And how that ramifies over time from, you know, the slave trade to, you know, the partition of the continent to the, you know, Jim Crow in America to, you know, migrations from the West Indies to Britain to, you know, how that ramifies.
Yeah, yeah. It has a different set of questions, I guess, from African diaspora, which is the other term that Catherine cites there. Okay, so we have another question that Joya Urazi had posed that I want to make sure we get to. Can you say a bit more about the way fugitive time appears and recedes and how it's linked to a new consciousness?
Yeah, thank you. So fugitive time appears in the different art forms that I study in the book, right? And it's not constant in any work that I study. I'll use the example of Toni Morrison again. It's almost like the appearance of the desire for kind of washing the body of historical and experienced violation, and kind of desire for transcendence, right? Desire for the moment when one is rid of violation. It emerges in pockets, and then it recedes, right? Because the novel Beloved, for instance, is not entirely about that. It's about many things. It has many characters, right? It has many kind of narrative vectors. But it kind of emerges in all these little ways and all these big ways. So the biggest way is in the chapter when Sethe reveals how she thinks and what she was thinking when she killed her own daughter, right? Which in her mind was granting her daughter release, right? So that she wouldn't have the experience, so that she wouldn't experience slavery, right? Because she killed her daughter. The intention was to kill all the best parts of her, all of her children, as Sethe's former slave owner was kind of in the horse cart coming to reclaim his property, right? And she saw this threshold into death as a kind of escape, right? Crossing to the other side of the veil, and as a kind of release, right? And so she describes it as in this really evocative utopian structure of desire. That's the most like resounding utopian moment in the novel. But the novel's filled with all these little micro moments of what I think I call these little micro moments of ease. So for instance, there's this memory of Paul D, while they were still enslaved on the plantation in Kentucky, going out to the cornfields and in the middle of the night and eating fresh corn. And to him, it's just like this ecstasy, like nothing else exists in the world but the taste of this sweet corn. Or another moment of taste that fuels this ecstatic desire and washes seemingly away violation fleetingly, is when Stampede, who's the person who brought Sethe across the Ohio River into Ohio when she was escaping slavery, when Stampede comes out from the bushes and with all these berries, all these bushes with all these prickers, and he's all torn up, but he has this bucket of berries, and he says that these berries, or Sethe remembers how the berries tasted like church, and she has a memory of how good they tasted. So there are these micro moments that kind of bubble up to the surface, right? Fugitive Time in Morrison's fiction bubbles up to the surface and then it kind of recedes, right? The same thing in Vera's work. The same thing in Aimé Césaire's Notebook of Return to the Native Land, right? So much of that is an accounting of violence, or of kind of like the history of enslavement, right? But also so much of that is kind of an expression of desire for flight, right? And so that you say, how is that linked to a new consciousness? It's linked. I would say Fugitive Time points toward a possibilities of a new being in the world, right? A new consciousness of the world, a new consciousness of your body, a new consciousness of who you are and how you exist in the world, right? A new consciousness of what it means to be alive, right? Wherever and whenever you may exist. So Fugitive Time points the way there. Fugitive Time is just like fugitivity is importantly not yet freedom, right? It's fugitivity is that space between freedom and unfreedom, right? That kind of liminal space. And Fugitive Time is that anticipatory gaze that looks out toward freedom, right? So it's that consciousness, anticipatory consciousness that kind of sees what freedom can be in advance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. That's really a very thoughtful response. Let me make sure. I'm going to ask the final question. And I think first I'll say that I also am hearing in what you're saying for us another layer of what the phenomenological has to do with here, right? That way of being that you're pointing to, and it is very much one of desire and of the anticipatory as productive and as rich in and of itself. That it's like the things fall apart that is invoked in re-invoked in Bulawayo is also the falling as an activity in a way of being falling into and an alternative to disappointment and to these ideas of an impossibility of freedom as a kind of foreclosure, right? That it shows us a kind of richness there and an activity there, a potential there that certainly I wouldn't have seen otherwise. My last question, again, is perhaps a little pedestrian, but I think it matters. So the texts that you walk us through in this are all gorgeous and accomplished and sophisticated and difficult kinds of aesthetic texts. But they're high aesthetic in a way that, in the Barber formulation, they would be not traditional and not popular, right? So my question is, what happens to the popular? Even, I think about Samb and Ra as very evidently politically and to some extent aesthetically oriented towards the people, right? But they're also refusing a certain kind of legibility. And so I'm curious, can your notion of the aesthetics speak to the popular, or is there something about its embeddedness in, in global capitalism and in questions of commodification that limit that? And what motivates your decision to gather these kinds of texts together and put them in conversation? Does that make sense? Or maybe motivates the erecting of those borders and why you didn't want to pull from the more popular.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I definitely think that Fugitive Time is legible in more popular forms. But there, I think part of what we do when we're writing as academics, as people who work in the humanities, is that we write on the things. One of the reasons why we curate the things that we curate is that we we write on the things that we love, you know. And I one among many reasons for the why I picked and curated the things that I did is that I kind of fell in love with these objects over time, or reading these novels like 8 to 10 times and watching these films a dozen times or more. But I certainly think these things are legible and in the popular. So for instance, I opened the book in the introduction with a lot of Equiano's slave narrative, 1789 slave narrative. And I talk about this one moment where, Tsitsi, you know this way too well, but I talk about this moment where he's brought up. Equiano's been captured in West Africa, and he's shackled and brought onto a slave ship and brought to the Americas. But during his months-long journey across the Atlantic, he like many people, he's suffering. He's not doing well. He's really not doing well. And so they bring him up from the hold of the ship and bring him on deck. And Equiano's, in his narrative, he's of course remembering this. This is all retrospective, and he's remembering how he thought in that moment when he's brought up on deck that he wished for the freedom of the inhabitants of the deep. So he's kind of proleptically imagining what it would feel like to have that freedom of those who kind of had already been thrown overboard or jumped overboard, or who kind of inhabit the sea, right? And I bring up Equiano because in that 1789 moment, that would have been like incredibly widely distributed literature, really throughout the world, in Britain particularly, but really throughout the world. And it had many, many editions. So that's a really, it's a very historical example to your question. But I think Fugitive Time is entirely legible in more in like science fiction and fantasy. I see like in Nalo Hopkinson in her novel Midnight Rider, or I'm sorry, Midnight. I'm trying to think. She has a wonderful novel. It's up on my shelf actually. She has a wonderful novel that kind of describes kind of a group of people escaping to another planet. But I see it, potentially in a host of different kinds of speculative fiction. So I definitely see it in more popular works.
Yeah, thank you. And I know with gratitude for your generosity in sharing some of that work that you teach on the speculative fiction as well. So I want to say, first of all, thank you to you for such a considered and generous exposition of the book and entertaining all of these questions. I want to also thank the ALA and particularly our fellow Cornell PhD, Akin Adeshokan, as well as Simon and the others in the ALA who have envisioned and launched these Saturday discussions. I think it's terrific and really enriches our sense of intellectual and ongoing intellectual exchange and connection. I thank Alexis and Farah, who behind the scenes have made sure that everything ran smoothly. And I thank the 100 people who watched portions or all of this, and those of you who stuck around for this conversation. So we wish you a wonderful weekend. And we just will reiterate that we congratulate you, Matt, and hope.
Thank you so much, Itzi.
Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Joaquin, Farah. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Great.
And thank you all for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you all, and you're getting a whole lot of thanks, Matt and Tsitsi in the chat.
It's
some
midnight
incredible
rock.
depth and expansions of thought in these discussions, reaches back for many older scholars to early research. Thanks, Matt. Congratulations, Matt, on this stunning book, and thanks, Tsitsi, for your deft moderation. Wonderful. This has been a terrific talk, and I loved your last answer, Matt. It just, that we do these things because we love them. And we also have, and my favorite phrase from W.B. Yeats, we have this fascination for what's difficult. So we keep going back because that is something which draws us in over and over again. So thank you both very, very much indeed. And I echo Tsitsi's thanks to Lexi and to Farah and to Matt Brown behind the scenes and to the ALA generally. And I would ask everybody, please, to mark your calendars for the next 2 remaining lectures in the series. On March the 23rd, we've got Nduka Otiono coming up talking about new Nigerian poets in the age of Japa. So please do tune in for that. That's, again, March 23rd, same time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then the final lecture in the series is going to be on April the 20th, given by Lokengaka Losambe and Tanure Ojaide about their new book on African diaspora writing, which should be out by then. So please, March 23rd, April the 20th for the next times. But in the meantime, thank you very much, Dr. Matthew Omelsky and Dr. Tsitsi Jaji. And farewell from the ALA for now.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Bye.